these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Sit Rep number 12, just the news, our situation report covering this last week of news, and there's been a lot of it. We're going to talk about tariffs, reconciliation, women taking back women's sports, and reviving the dire wolf. So yesterday, President Trump announced a 90-day pause on Liberation Day tariffs for most U.S. trading partners, choosing negotiation over escalation, while also ratcheting pressure up on China. Now, the president is still imposing a 10% reciprocal tariff on more than 75 countries, a measure that would presumably be lifted after negotiating a more favorable trade deal for the United States. The exception, of course, is China. It's a tit-for-tat escalation. President Trump actually raised tariffs on Chinese goods to 125% after China increased its tariffs on American goods to 84%, citing China's continued disregard for global market rules. Now, see, China engages in a wide range of unfair trading practices, from dumping to discriminatory non-tariff barriers to forced technology transfers and outright theft. Now, let's not forget China's tariff escalation during President Trump's first term, when they slapped steep tariffs on U.S. steel, aluminum, and a variety of agricultural products. Here's the bottom line. With the pause, President Trump is giving the world a brief window to negotiate, but the message is clear. America will not sit back and let nefarious actors game the system. He believes in fair trade, not just free trade that only benefits everyone else. And I think that's a reasonable position to take. Now, moving on to the Supreme Court. It approves of President Trump's deportations. This is a big deal. On Monday, the Supreme Court made a 5-4 ruling that allows the Trump administration to resume use of the Aliens Enemies Act to deport alleged Venezuelan gang members to El Salvador. It's a big win for the president. It should also be said the Supreme Court ruled that the government has to give deportees, quote, reasonable time to challenge their removal in court before leaving the country. So this decision reinforces the idea that the president does have extra authority when dealing with serious national security threats, while ensuring that we're in a country built on due process and the rule of law. The court also clarified that this is really important, clarified that legal challenges should happen where detainees are held. In this case, it was Texas, not just in D.C. Now, this makes sense. A D.C. court making a decision on a case in Texas it should not be happening, and it's great that the Supreme Court has now clarified this. You keep courts local and keep them efficient. After the ruling, President Trump took to Truth Social, calling it a great day for justice in America. Attorney General Pam Bondi echoed the sentiment on X, writing, "Tonight's decision is a landmark victory for the rule of law." Justice Sotomayor, joined by the two other liberal justices, dissented, warning of an extraordinary threat to the rule of law. Justice Barrett faced some criticism for breaking from the majority and partially joining the dissent. In a related case, the Supreme Court sided again with the Trump administration by temporarily pausing a judge's order to return a Maryland man who was mistakenly deported to El Salvador despite having legal status in the U.S. Now, at the end of the day, this isn't about politics. It's about national security, protecting American citizens, and making sure dangerous actors don't take advantage of our system. It's also a very necessary conversation, really a political and civics conversation about the natural contention and checks and balances between the executive and the judiciary. It is up to both to interpret the laws. It is up to the executive to execute those laws. Sometimes those laws are too vague. It's up to Congress to make them less vague, but Congress doesn't always do that, and we definitely don't act in unison. That's why these things happen. And over the past 20 years or so, there's just been a large increase in single district judges stopping entire policies by the executive. And we should also note that on Wednesday, House Republicans took action on this particular issue. We passed the No Rogue Rulings Act. This legislation is aimed at limiting the reach of so-called rogue judges who have paused many of President Trump's executive orders from taking effect. And it would generally prohibit district court judges from issuing nationwide injunctions that extend to non-parties of lawsuits and fast-track the appeals process by appointing 3-judge panels at random to hear cases involving the same dispute in different jurisdictions, and allowing that panel to then issue an injunction that would otherwise be prohibited. So we're finally putting some reasonable safeguards on this process, and that's exactly what Congress needs to do. Now, on to the ongoing battle on reconciliation. This morning, the House passed the Senate amended version of President Trump's comprehensive budget resolution. This is a key step in the reconciliation process aimed at extending President Trump's tax cuts to ensure your taxes won't increase. Now, if you haven't already, I encourage you to check out my previous podcast with Paul Winfrey, where we really break down the reconciliation process and how the budget is actually built. I won't get into those details now. Just know that a few weeks ago, the House passed our own framework for the budget resolution, which included significant deep spending cuts, $1.5 trillion. Now, the rub here is the Senate's version, which passed last Friday, only had $4 billion in cuts. So a lot of difference there. Now, remember, the House and Senate have to pass identical versions of a bill to leave Congress. Now, this is a debate over the framework of the budget resolution, but people should keep in mind, it does not prevent us from making further cuts during later steps in the reconciliation process. That's why we were pushing to just accept the Senate amendment, because it does not prevent us from taking on the cuts that we in the House have already decided to do. In fact, on my committee on Energy and Commerce, we were working on that yesterday and all this morning, figuring out where those savings are going to come from. So just because the Senate bill says $3 billion in savings doesn't mean that we aren't going to be pushing for $1.5 trillion, and we're going to send that to the Senate. That's what's going to happen. We can still win this. We will still win this. Now, some of my colleagues are concerned that if we don't mandate significant spending cuts in the first step, it'll never actually happen. And I get their concern there. But I would also remind them that they can always vote against the final bill. Die on the Hill at that time. Don't die on the Hill now, because you're not even letting us get started. Luckily, they were convinced, and we got that passed today, so we can get started. So regardless of the debate over spending cuts and offsets, I mean, here's the bottom line. The whole point of this reconciliation bill, it keeps your taxes right where they are. If Congress doesn't pass it, if we do nothing, your taxes will go up in December, because the TCJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was 2017, under President Trump, it expires, which means your individual income taxes go up. We don't want that to happen. That's why we're not giving up on this. We're doing everything we can to stand with the president and extend that tax package. So I'm very glad that that bill passed today, so that we can really get to the actual work of each committee has its instructions. On my committee, again, we're going to have to find a lot of savings, which I think is very necessary. On to women's sports. Since President Trump signed an executive order protecting women's sports from male competitors, his administration has increased scrutiny on schools that continue to allow men in women's spaces. Last Friday, the Department of Education and Department of Justice announced a Title IX special investigations team to handle and expedite cases into entities that continue allowing biological males to compete in female sports, denying women's civil rights. Meanwhile, more stories and videos are emerging of women speaking out against transgenderism in sports, and I think that's a great thing. They are no longer silenced. Now, this new special investigations team marks a significant escalation in enforcement, signaling clearly to schools and athletic programs nationwide, if you accept taxpayer funding, compliance with Title IX, and fair competition, it's mandatory. Attorney General Pam Bondi emphasized the administration's firm stance, stating, "This will enable our attorneys to take comprehensive action when women's sports or spaces are threatened, using the full power of law to remedy any violation of women's civil rights." This seems like an obvious issue. I almost feel sorry for Democrats for having to take the opposite stance on this. The Trump administration is actively pursuing several investigations, including one into Portland public schools. Of course, it's Portland. This investigation involves a trans-identifying male athlete who dominated the girls' 200-meter and 400-meter track events, setting new season records. Additionally, the administration is examining Oregon's statewide policy permitting participation based on gender identity. Additionally, high-profile protests from female athletes are gaining attention. Stephanie Turner, women's fencer, was disqualified at the Cherry Blossom Open after taking a knee in protest rather than facing a transgender opponent. Now, part of me says that she should have just kicked his ass, but she was making a statement, and I think that's also the right thing to do because more women need to speak out. Turner said, "This is a serious issue happening within all sports. It's a civil rights movement for women and girls, and I prioritize the safety, rights, and protection of women and girls over trans-identified males." Good for her. The movement is not about hate. It's about fairness. Across the country, women athletes and officials are standing up, determined to reclaim and protect their rightful spaces in sports. In other interesting news, we've brought back the dire wolf. Scientists at Colossal Biosciences say they've taken the first real step in de-extinction, birthing 3 genetically engineered wolf pups with physical traits of the long-extinct dire wolf. You may remember the dire wolf from Game of Thrones. To be clear, Colossal Biosciences is calling this a genetic recreation. It's not a clone. They created the wolf pups using their new gene editing technology. Dire wolves once dominated Ice Age North America, outcompeting gray wolves with sheer size and strength. They were bigger than wolves we have today. They hunted horses, bison, possibly mammoths. Colossal Biosciences used CRISPR, a gene editing technology, to modify cells from a living gray wolf and mix them with DNA obtained from a 13,000-year-old dire wolf skull. This is the return of American manufacturing, folks. Prehistoric wolves made in America. Next Jurassic Park. Now, jokes aside, imagine the potential to use this technology to save near-extinct species, such as the northern white rhino, of which only 2 remain worldwide. Now, there's certainly major ethical considerations humanity must address. Breakthroughs like this remind us that the possibilities of science are potentially limitless, and we have to proceed with caution. Now, if you read nothing else, good reading for this week. Article by journalist Fabiola Sanchez titled, "Investigation of Ranch in Northern Mexico Reveals Some Details of Jalisco Cartel's Operations." It's a good primer on how violent and militarized the cartels in northern Mexico have become. These organizations are terrorist insurgents. They're heavily armed, trained. They're a direct threat to the United States. If you want to become an expert, this is a good place to start. It gives an overview of the inter-cartel conflict, how they're conducting an insurgency against the Mexican government, and how the Mexican public is waking up to this reality.